Hello everybody, this is the Wikstrand. So Thunderball is mostly remembered for being A, the most successful James Bond film of all time, and B, being an absolute fan favorite and hailed as one of the best James Bond films of all time. I cannot argue with the first one because according to inflation it is still one of the most successful movies of all time, but I can argue with the second one because this is the second worst James Bond film I think I've ever seen. It has so many things that works against itself, and I honestly cannot understand why people really like this movie. Let's find out in Thunderball! Thanks a lot, Stunt Double. In Austin Powers, Dr. Evil famously says that they're going to quote-unquote steal some nuclear weapons and hold the world ransom for $1 million. In this movie, Spectre steals some nuclear weapons and holds the world ransom for $100 million in diamonds. I always felt it was a little bit petty for an organization, you know, hell-bent on world domination and stuff like that. It was a bit, At this point, we don't know who number one is when it comes to Spectre. Spoiler alert, it's Blofeld. But we do know who number two is. It is Largo, this eye patch wearing, henchman shark feeding villain who is responsible for this. And Bond, goes to the Bahamas to try to track him down and find out, where he has hidden them and all that good stuff. And Largo's a memorable villain, and he has a good lair, and he has a big boat, and he feeds, bad henchmen to his sharks, and he has complete control over this poor woman named Domino that James Bond is gonna have to, rescue. And we should have a fantastic classic James Bond film, but we do not. One of the reasons why I think this movie doesn't work that well is they're building up this movie for quite a bit. There's a lot of things that does not happen after, the initial fight in France, because we're spending so much time with James Bond in a spa, and the stealing of the warheads and the build up in Bahamas, and to get to the ending, which is an underwater fight between a bunch of scuba diving people underwater, which is very slow and incredibly boring. I've said it before and I can say it again. I hate underwater sequences. They just move so slow and they are so uninteresting. The only underwater sequence I can remember that I actually liked is the one from Aquaman and The Abyss. Almost everything else sucks. And when we don't have the underwater fight, we have above sea level a fight between Largo and Bond on the boat. And that is, sped up to the point where it looks like a fucking Benny Hill sketch, so that didn't work. There is also large sections of this movie that could have been straight up cut, simply because they don't add anything to the story and they don't add anything to the characters, in my opinion. And the sequences at the spa, for instance, it is boring and it goes on forever and doesn't have a very good payoff to the whole thing. And all these sequences of the surveillance of Largo isn't very interesting or fascinating, and it doesn't really lead to anything. James Bond gets to swim with some sharks and shoot some, fools with his harpoon and, has some great lines, but there isn't really much happening and it doesn't really lead up to anything great. Now, there are, of course, fantastic things about this movie. Sean Connery is great. We have a fucking great villain. We have Ken Adams' fantastic set that looks amazing. It's big and spectacular, but it doesn't have a good payoff. If it would have had a good payoff, a spectacular finish to the whole thing, maybe it could have worked. But in this case, it feels like a very underwhelming James Bond film. It's far inferior to both Dr. No and From Russia with Love. It's by far the worst Sean Connery movie, and it doesn't have that much interesting characters except for Bond and Largo. Domino is a bleak Bond girl, and except for the villainous Fiona, who has her own agenda and wants to kill James Bond, I like that bit. But apart from that, this is a pretty dull, pretty uninteresting Bond film without any great spectacular action sequences, except of course for the fight in France with jetpacks and the Aston Martin use and stuff like that. That was great. The rest of the movie is kind of with the exceptionally bad ending, which was... what was that? Was that the best they could come up with? This is one of these movies I wish were better, but I cannot in good faith give this movie anything more than 42 points. It is a bad James Bond film. It's an underwhelming James Bond film, and despite its good spirit and despite its great cinematography, it cannot rise above the okay level. And let's face it, 130 minutes is far too much for this movie. So we'll see you next time for well, so and so reviewing well, such and such. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.